Now we're going to take another closer look at the exposure meter and how you use it to determine the correct exposure, and also how to use it so that you can be more creative with your exposure settings. Whenever I start to compose a photograph, I look at the light first. The light falling on the main subject of the composition, if there is one, must be pleasing. The light on the background must also be considered. If there are areas in the background that are too dark or too bright, this can adversely affect my photograph. As we learned earlier, the camera's exposure meter reads light reflecting off the subject. We also learned that our eyes can see a wider contrast ratio than our cameras, and our cameras do not always record the scene as we see it. When we're photographing in high contrast lighting conditions, it's vital to take the light reading from the part of our composition that we consider most important, the part that we want exposed correctly. Let's take a look at the main exposure meter settings. Most cameras have 3 standard meter settings: center weighted, averaged, and spot. The center weighted setting takes a reading from about 60 to 70% from the center of the composition. In my first cameras, this was the only exposure meter setting that there was. There was no option to change it, and it's considered somewhat redundant now because it's only really useful if you are composing with your subject in the center of the frame every time. Most of the time my exposure meter is set to average. This is the default setting on many cameras. In this setting, the meter takes readings from multiple zones, analysing the light and dark tones from across the whole frame, and returning an averaged reading based on this information. The camera will also take into account where your point of focus is and consider that part of the composition more important. I also frequently use the spot meter setting. Using the spot meter setting allows you to take a reading from a very precise area of your composition. I find this setting most useful when there's high contrast ratio in the scene and I want to ensure my subject is correctly exposed. I choose the spot meter setting and then take a reading from just the subject, ignoring the light information in the rest of the image. For example, if I'm photographing a person against a very bright background, I will take a spot meter reading from their face and set my exposure accordingly. This will give me a photograph with the main subject well exposed. If I used the center weighted or averaged meter settings in this example, I would likely end up with my subject underexposed because the meter would be reading too much from the bright background. In manual mode, once you have made a reading and adjusted your settings, they will not change if you recompose your image. If you are working with your camera in an auto mode and recompose your photo, the camera will adjust the exposure if the light reflecting from the scene changes. This can be particularly noticeable when using the spot meter. The tone ratio between my subject's face and the foreground is vast, so if on an auto mode I take a reading from my subject's face and then recompose, the camera will adjust and give me a correct exposure for the background, which is not what I want. Often when I'm working, I will take an exposure reading from an object or part of the scene where the light being reflected is of a similar value to the light reflecting off my subject. I'll usually do this if I want to get a natural photo of a person or a street scene. The reason I do this is to get my camera setting close to correct, so that when I have my subject's attention, I'm not fiddling around trying to get my exposure set properly and can concentrate on capturing a good expression or the action unfolding in the street. I find that many people have a limited understanding of how their exposure meter in the camera works. Learning to use the exposure meter and to use the different settings it has will help you have more control over your exposures and therefore be more creative with your photography.